Hello, everyone. I am Runsy, and this is Molly.
Hey, guys.
So today we're going to be speaking about the amazing work of Molly. And can you just briefly describe a little bit about how you want to describe your work?
Oh, man, this is always the nightmare question for artists. So I'm an artist and a writer from New York City. I'm someone who got my start drawing in nightclubs, drawing the most depraved customers and the most beautiful and diamond-hard men and women as performers. And then from there, I segued to covering protests, prisons, rebellions, and wars around the world. My most recent work, which is coming out in about 2 weeks, is a book called Brothers of the Gun, which is a memoir of the Syrian war that I co-authored and I illustrated with a brilliant journalist named Marwan Hisham from Raqqa. I also have covered Guantanamo Bay, the migrant labor camps in Abu Dhabi, the Syrian refugee crisis, prisoners protesting solitary confinement in Pennsylvania, and most recently, a lot about Puerto Rico after Maria, which is the island where my dad is from.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to read Drawing Blood, and within it, I just noticed so much like a human side to the artist, especially like, oh, this is Molly, especially like taking on all of these roles while you were working to become an artist. Usually I notice it's like a linear path. You speak a lot about how do you become this artist in the white wall gallery? It's like, oh, you have an MFA. And it's like, well, how your path was a little bit different. I was working like drawing, I was modeling, I was doing all of these different things, and I'm like, oh, I relate to that. Like sometimes I hand model, like I do the weirdest things ever just to become an artist. And it's like, how would you describe that path? Like, would you describe it as something that is strictly for you, or have you noticed a lot of artists having that similar path?
Well, I think that art, it's such a weird career, right? And so few people actually get to do it for a living. And of those people, so many of them, frankly, come from rich families, and then they go to Yale, and there's like a very linear path of how that works. But for everyone else, there is no like neat, scalable way to become an artist. We all have to fight out different paths. Now, for me, I was a very bad student. I was a bad high school student. I was a bad college student. I became a college dropout. I would probably have been a bad employee if I had if anyone had been foolish enough to give me a proper job. So I sort of had to carve out my entire weird circuitous path by hustling money however I could and then hustling art opportunities however I could. So the first drawings I did professionally, I would put up ads in bodegas and advertise to draw people's cats and dogs for 20 bucks a piece. I would put up ads in the comic store advertising to draw people's Dungeons and Dragons characters. I then would like work as a model for sketchy photographers. I once posed in a music video where live crickets were poured on my face. I did a lot of very dignified things like this in my quest to avoid proper employment. But through it all, I wanted to draw, right? I have been drawing since I was 4 years old. And so I feel like, and something we were talking about before, we like had this burning thing that we always wanted to do, but then we tried every single possible like circuitous path to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important part about being an artist. Like as an artist, you're like a hustler and you have to figure out what you're gonna do. Like you said in your book, it was like, oh, like hard working gets you only far enough, and so does talent. Like you actually have to go and kind of bring yourself in these situations. And I feel like with the emergence of social media culture and the internet and Instagram, how do you find that as a positive thing, as a negative thing for artists? How do you find that changing the art world?
It's changed it so much. So I'm 34, which means that I think I was like the last generation that kind of became adults without being on social media and without having to, like we were on the internet, but we weren't necessarily on social media except for Usenet. And So because of that, I remember very, very vividly what it was like before, which was just there were galleries, and they had a very snotty person sitting at the front desk, and you felt personally ashamed to be in them. And there was not a single way in the world that I at least could imagine bridging the gap between me and them. Like, we could have stood in the same room, but we could have had oceans between us. And in that time, that was kind of pre-social media, I would just hang my work in coffee shops and bars. I would hang it on any wall that would have me, and they would be like very little shows, and all my friends are broke, so my friends would try to support, but it wasn't like something I could make money out of. And in terms of getting illustration work, I remember I would sit in Barnes & Noble and I would copy out all the art directors' addresses from all of the insides of the magazines, and then I would like make these very actually in retrospect quite naive and pitiful little packets of printouts of my work on my like terrible little printer that like had lines and bands, and like send them to the art directors begging them to hire me. And that's how it was in the days before.
But I feel like when you say that, it actually, when I was reading it, I'm like, hey, I need to do that. Like, you only get so far on the internet. I'm like, I'm gonna keep referring to it as the internet. Like, you only get so far, and it becomes like this weird world with like personal branding, and like you become the artist as well as just like you become the artist in the work, and it's like you can't necessarily separate those two. And it's like, well, when do you go into like real life and meet these people that aren't part of like your social media persona?
Yeah, exactly. In social media, I hate Twitter now. Like, I don't know why I keep going back to it, like an abusive relationship. I loathe it. But I also owe so much of my career to it, especially as a journalist. I think that there was this very early window with social media before everyone was on it, when like, the people who are on it tended to be like dorks and geeks and artists and maybe some media people and writers. And like a lot of people, including me, we have this sort of utopian memory of that. It was like, that was the golden age, before it was all like Nazis and eggs threatening to rape you to death, and stuff like other beautiful things in the internet as it is now. I mean, I think that the key is to remember that actually not everyone is online, right? And that there is like this whole world that is not on Twitter and Instagram, and like you should do your work and you should put it online because you need to. I mean, dear God, if your work isn't online, I mean, that's, unless you have some other massive infrastructure behind you, like how else will it be seen? But you also have to make sure that you're working offline as well, like in the streets or in whatever other space that you can connect with people that don't use the internet. And also, I mean, on the internet, it's so easy to flatten people into either objects of worship or objects of derision and hate, whereas that's something that's much harder to do face to face, and there's much more complexity and richness in dealing with people face to face, in my opinion.
And how would you find your articles circulating? Like, do you find it when you write and you have your illustrations attached to it? Like, how do you create your art? Like, is that shown in gallery spaces at all? Is it strictly to live on the internet? Do you print those out? Like, how are these accessible to the people aside from like what I read online?
Man, I do everything. Like, so to give you an idea of perhaps the life of like one image, I created this piece. It was a picture of Julia de Burgos, who's probably the coolest and most famous Puerto Rican poet. And I created it originally to do as a mural in my friend's barrio in Humacao in Puerto Rico. I wanted to do just like a big paste-up of Julia de Burgos because she's cool. So first it lives on the wall there, right? But then I take an Instagram picture of it, of course, or put it on my Twitter. But then I wrote an article about Julia, and so I also had this accompanying that article. And I also might use it, sell it as a print, or I might exhibit the original in a gallery. I mean, I think one of the cool things about visual image is that it can live many lives. It doesn't necessarily have to be just for one thing.
And when you sell the images, I know sometimes it's like, as artists, it's like, do you sell your work or do you not sell your work? There's like this like image of the artist, and it's like, no, we do not sell art. And it's like, well, you still have to eat. Like, so when you sell these images that are of other people, how do you do that? Do you have like a personal conflict? Is it easy to let go? Like, how does that work for you?
Well, so I guess my personal thing is I tend not to sell prints of stuff that I've done from like conflict or from people suffering.
Okay.
I probably wouldn't, and I'm not saying it's unethical if anyone else does it, but it's my own personal thing. So like, for instance, I probably wouldn't sell as prints drawings I did in Gaza. However, I would totally sell as prints drawings I did of like my burlesque dancer friend, like looking fabulous. And I'd probably ask her, I'd be like, hey, Amber, can I sell a print of you? But I feel like for me, there's a different relationship between those two things. In terms of selling original work, I have to tell a little story here. My great-grandfather is a painter, or my great-grandfather was a painter, and he painted and painted and painted throughout his life. He must have done a painting a day, and you know, at the end of his life, I mean, he had so many paintings, right? So many paintings. And I think it's better for an artist if those paintings that you've done are circulating freely throughout the world, like dandelion seeds ready to make new flowers, right? As opposed to, just sitting in your studio, right? Yeah. Ready to fall on you like a Collier Brothers, like the Collier Brothers were killed by their own stacks of books. So I don't see any problem with selling original work. I mean, I guess the only moral conflict was if you sold it to a real scumbag, and I think that perhaps what happens with artists is that a lot of the people that actually have, $1 million or $10 million are scumbags, because that's how you get $1 million or $10 million. But I unfortunately don't have to deal with this moral conflict. If anyone wants to make any offers, I can judge.
And when you have your work, how does this? You described how you made this mural, you Instagrammed it, then you wrote the piece. Is it always that linear? Like to create that? Like do you always have like, I'm gonna do this, this, and this? Or do you sometimes just sit there and like draw anything that doesn't have to really do with like politics or activism?
Absolutely, I think it's one of the problems is like once an artist gets known as like an artist who does stuff with activism, then people expect you to do nothing else in the world except stuff with activism. And I can think of nothing more hollowing and fatal to your creativity as having to only do stuff with activism forevermore and never engage with anything else in life because you are an activist, blah, blah, blah. No, I mean, sometimes I just draw stuff because it's cool. One of my favorite drawings that I did recently was in my friend's barrio, the one I was telling you about. There is this bar that all the old guys sit at, and these old guys just like sit there and they play dominoes. They play dominoes from like the time the bar opens to the time the bar closes, and they bet on who's gonna buy the next round. And they're just like these cool old dudes who are friends with each other. And I would hang out at this bar and I would sketch the guys, and like they have these faces, they've worked like hard, they've had hard lives, and their faces tell like these huge stories, and you could hang with them and they'll tell you about their past, about what they've done, and I wanted to capture that, right? So I just like hung with these old dudes. And I eventually did this painting of them playing their dominoes, this big, and it's really just about like cool old guys. It's not, oh, this is an activist message about the strength of the Puerto Rican people or any of such shit. It's about like old men having fun.
Yeah, and I think that's like that's very interesting to me. I'm like, yes, this is Molly. This is a human. This isn't the political and activist side to her. Yeah. And I feel like with what you put out into the world, it's like so easy to attach labels to artists as like being this political artist that makes writing and all of this type of work. And it's like, do you find yourself liking more of that type of work because it's like you get better feedback or so to like kind of like hiding this personal work and not showing it out to the light?
I mean, I think that I go through phases in what I focus on. Some people, they can just focus on one thing until they die, and they can do that thing best ever, but I'm just not like that. So after I do a project that's quite grim, like my last book project, for instance, Brothers of the Gun, I might want to be like, no, I want to do stuff that celebrates my beautiful friends, and how much I love them. And likewise, after I spent years drawing nightclubs and burlesque dancers, I was like, no, I want to draw protest, that's what I want to do. I think that one of the problems with the idea of like personal brand or the internet is it's just such a narrow box to shove yourself into, and we're humans, right? We contain multitudes. We have all sorts of things, frivolous, very, very serious, tragic things, funny things, us being virtuous, us being horrible, cynical bastards. And the internet and the way people are perceived on that, doesn't allow that, right? It's like, you are this, no, you are this. You betrayed your role as this because you used this bad word, so now you're this box. And it's like so frustrating. That's not how people are, man.
Yeah, and I feel like I can relate to that too. And just like the way, the art of storytelling, and you tell stories, whether through your images and writing, and just being like, oh, I'm gonna write this piece, but I use this bad word, and it's like, I'm not supposed to say that, and now I'm gonna get dragged to death on the internet. And it's like, well, I feel like it's a little bit different with illustration, because it's like, you're kind of pouring like your heart onto these pieces. And how do you describe the art of storytelling, like within yourself and your work?
Oh man, well, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to think of a good answer for this. I mean, I like the stories of smart people who are fighters. I like the stories of people who perhaps the world is doing badly by them, but who are cynical and funny and who are determined to live their own truth. That's what I've always been drawn to in the type of journalistic stories that I covered. I've never been drawn into easy stories about victims. I don't, there are many people who write that, but I'm not one of them. So for instance, one of my favorite stories was about migrant workers in Abu Dhabi. And these are people who have, undergone a lot of oppression, right? Like they, very often they go to Abu Dhabi on false pretenses and then have their passports taken away and are paid like much, much less than they thought they were going to, and they're in debt and it's abusive and it's all of that, right? But the guy that I ended up focusing on in my story was this young South Asian guy who had come in the circumstances, but who ended up translating and giving information to all of this media. And he did that because he was like, no, I'm not this machine that this state wants me to be. I'm a man, I'm my own person. And it was his stories of people like him I wanted to tell. Or I did a piece about prisoners that were in solitary confinement for a long time, which I believe is torture. And one of the prisoners who I focused on, despite the fact that he had been in prison since he was 15 on a drug charge, he got himself certified to be a paralegal, and he sued the state, and he got $180,000. And he was like a total jailhouse lawyer and organizer and whistleblower, even from inside solitary. And that was the type of story that attracted me. And when I write about those people, I don't want to just paint them as like these cardboard saints. I want to paint them as the full people they are, with their wit and their skepticism and their own interests. And so I guess that's why I choose the type of stories that I do tell.
Yeah, that's amazing, especially because you're adding a human aspect to people who are constantly just kind of in the hiding. Like you're using your platform to give these people a voice, which is pretty great to hear. Especially within just the criminal justice system and all of that. I feel like even though you're not making strictly political art, or you're just telling these stories and not attaching oh, I don't know, this might be about the time that you were at home and you're living this memory, and it's great to see that in your work, especially when I was viewing just photos, and I'm oh, that's what they look like. That's pretty cool. Oh, I imagine them chubbier or skinnier, and I really like that in your work, especially with just the way you illustrated the whole book. You added all of these illustrations. Did they come before the writing, or how did you do that? Just because I'm not aware of writing and illustrations. I know when I do illustrations, I have to read something thoroughly, especially with your new book. I have to read something thoroughly. I have to look at the title. I have to do my research, and then I'll be okay, now this is the illustration that attaches it. How do you work that out with writing a book?
So with my first book, because it was just mine alone, some of them I did before. I had certain things I just knew they were going to be cool images and I wanted to do. And then as I had a rough draft, I looked through it and I was what needs art? And I made this list. I ended up making a list of 100 images that I was going to draw, and I put it on my door, and every day I would cross one off of it. And then as I edited things, I might cut out an image or whatever because the scene that it related to wasn't in there. With my new book, Brothers of the Gun, because it's a collaboration with Marwan, we worked very, very closely together to try to figure out what were the images that were most important to his memories of the war and of the revolution and just of his life. And some of them were quite everyday images, right? Like a cup of coffee and a cigarette, you know, the traditional like sort of, yeah, a cup of Arabic coffee, glass of water, cigarette, just like traditional like what you would have for breakfast. And some of them were very, very complicated. For instance, there is one scene that he described to me that was when ISIS fighters they had all come into a cafe and were using it kind of as an internet cafe. And these guys were all wounded. They all had bits of themselves blown off. And the way that we did this was, he was like, there were this many fighters and they were such and such nationalities. And this guy, I remember, he had a wound on his side, and I'd be like, okay, so how did he sit when he had a wound on his side? And Marwan might either draw me a little stick figure, or he might take a selfie to, you know, ow. And then he'd be like, this guy drank this brand of energy drink, so here's a picture of this energy drink if you're not familiar with it. And I would do all these sketches, and then he'd be like, no, this is cliche, like this is bullshit, it's not how you do it. And we would work it out together until I had enough information, I could see it clearly through his eyes, and I would make it into a finished piece. And part of the reason Brothers of the Gun took so long was I did 82 illustrations like that. And these were all things, some of them I did have photo reference from Marwan, or even some reference I took, but a lot of them, the majority of them, were trying to excavate memory.
Yeah, that's pretty hard, especially like if you're drawing either from memory or like just constantly having someone there like, that's not how you do it.
Yeah.
Was it frustrating? Like at any point did you just want to be like, you know what, I'm done with this. Like I am not like, was there any moments like that, especially like this little behind the scenes on like that aspect of the book? Like being an artist is hard, especially if you're trying to attach the words to the work.
I mean, I think that both of us, artists and writers, were both egomaniacs. That's how we are, and I think we both had very strong visions of what we wanted, and you know, we fought for those visions. But there was no other way that I could illustrate a book based on someone else's life without giving them that sort of control. Otherwise, it would just be, you know, it would be insincere, right? It would be a lie. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that I had seen. You know, it wasn't my eyes that had been in that cafe, or wasn't my body that was under an American bomb, or a regime bomb. So even though, yeah, obviously, like I'm an artist, I'm like, my way is right, blah blah blah. There was no other way to make the work that needed to be made without having that sort of very close collaboration with Marwan. And I mean, for that reason, I do view the work in the book, even though I drew it with my own hands, I view that art as both of our work.
That's nice. Yeah, that's nice to hear. And as a journalist and like doing all of that, how was the traveling aspect to creating the work?
So I traveled, basically commuted to and from Turkey to create Brothers of the Gun. Marwan is Syrian, and as I'm sure all of you are aware, Syrians do not have an easy it's not easy for Syrians to travel freely in the world at this moment. And so Marwan couldn't leave Turkey, and so I would travel to him. But the real travel was the travel that he did. Marwan is a native of Raqqa, which was the city that for several years ISIS had occupied and declared it to be its caliphate. So he lived under this incredibly repressive and horrific armed group, and he did journalism undercover at the risk of his life. He even filed for the New York Times and for foreign policy under them. It's an act of incredible bravery. And he was able to, at that time, because he was working undercover, even go to Mosul when it was occupied by ISIS. And he later traveled to Aleppo, which at the time was held by rebels, and it was being bombed many, many times every day by the Syrian regime. So these were travel to places that no longer really exist in the same way that they did. The Mosul that Marwan visited was mostly destroyed by American bombs, at least in the old city. The same with the Raqqa that he lived in, and the Aleppo that he attended university in and that he later wrote about for Vanity Fair is also heavily destroyed by bombs of the Syrian government and Russia. So a lot of what we would talk about when we were doing this book is we were talking about how to use his travels and use what he had seen and use my artwork to document memory of things that were lost.
And did you find some sort of censorship in there? Not on your end, but kind of like on the publishing side of it?
Nah, no, the publishers was great.
All right, and like, just like, even then, like, just putting it out there, especially like with, I guess, different laws and all of that, like, did you see anything like being like, putting a halt to the truth?
I mean, it wasn't, so there are some things that I wouldn't do for safety. Like, for instance, I would never non-consensually draw someone's face, you know, who lived under an oppressive government that might arrest them. That's just not something I would do. And I would use all sorts of ways to avoid endangering someone, you know, by that. But I never did come against any, trying to think of, I mean, I've definitely been, I think the only example I've ever had of like real censorship of what I did was when I covered Guantanamo Bay, because in Guantanamo there are so many rules that the US government imposes that you, so at first the rules, they sound like normal. They're like, oh, or not normal, but they sound doable. Like, you can't take pictures of people's heads, and you can't take pictures of doors, and you can't take pictures of the cameras that are on the walls. But then before you know it, when you're not taking pictures of people's faces, you're not taking pictures of any doors, you're not taking pictures of any cameras, what do you have? You have the floor, right? That's what you end up taking pictures of. So with my own drawings, I would draw around those things, and the way that I would try to do that, because I didn't want to hide the censorship, is if they told me, for instance, I couldn't draw soldiers' faces, I would replace them all with smiley faces. The idea was that I wanted to draw the censorship explicitly. Or when they told me that I couldn't draw the prisoners' faces, I like sort of just scribbled them out like with violent like black, so that you would know that there was a reason that those were missing. And in many ways, I felt that the drawing the censorship was something more important than the specificity of any particular soldier's face. But in terms of my last two books, I didn't deal with any censorship.
And I think that's the beauty of drawing versus photo. We talked about that earlier, like just being a photographer or like photography in itself, and it's like drawing and kind of how you're able to change these little things just with the pencil. I think that's very important. And within your book, you also spoke about photography briefly. Like, was it, you said that they were, some of the images were based on reference images. How would you, would most of them, like, I know the Guantanamo Bay ones were based on, you were actually there, and no photos were allowed.
No photos were allowed. I mean, I think that there were photographers who had like a special way to do it, but I don't even have a professional camera, and like they wouldn't let me take iPhone photos, so it was like all from just life.
And a lot of the stuff, do you just like snap pictures? What's like the process? Do you snap pictures of like anything you see and then just come back and like look at it, or like how does that work?
So I am a uniquely untalented photographer. My photos are blurry. They sometimes have my thumb in them. They're terrible. So I just take a million photos when I travel, and I know how to work with my own bad photos to make them into something good. When I'm sorry. When I'm drawing, but yeah, if you ever looked at my hard drive, it's just like a million blurry, terrible, out of focus, slightly tilted iPhone photos that I somehow make into something good.
And with that, I know I was looking at your Instagram and like your social media, and like you started posting, you were posting about like Puerto Rico and all of that. And how do you feel, how does it feel? Like, I know when I go on vacation, it's like, oh, I took all these pictures on vacation. It's a nice vacation. Like, how do you get ideas from them? Like, I know it's so hard to be like, oh, that was a nice vacation, Runsy. Like, you saw a lot of palm trees, you saw a beach. Yeah. Like, how do you actually like get work from that?
I mean, I guess, well, usually when I'm working, like I go in thinking about like I go in thinking that I'm gonna do work about it. I haven't done too much cool drawings of like justifications that I didn't have any other purpose for. But very often what I try to do is I try to think like, what's the thing that's going to sum up a truth of the situation. So for example, I have this one picture that I did about Gaza, and I was in Shujaiya, which was the neighborhood that Israel destroyed in 2014, and I saw this building, and it was completely wrecked, like it had been bombed. And in front of the building, there were guys that were taking the rebar from the building, and they were hammering with hand tools, so it would be straight again, so they could reuse it. And if you've ever seen rebar from a destroyed building, it's very evil looking. It looks to me like snakes or something. It looks like coiled, to attack someone. It's very horrifying when it's twisted. And I wanted to do something that showed these people taking this very sinister looking material and making it into the material of reconstruction. I wanted something that would show that resilience and that strength. And so I snapped a picture of these guys that were, working straightening this rebar in the shadow of this building, and I was like, that's going to be it. That's what I want to say about here.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I was also going to ask you about your, so you describe your mother as an artist. What was the influence of having art in your home since young? Especially you describe the school system, and you didn't get to graduate college, and how that obviously impacted the way you make your work and the ideas that your parents put into your work. I know your dad's had a strong political background. How do you see that in you? Did you, I know it came later, everything was nothing is in a very orderly form, but how has that impacted you?
Well, one of the best gifts that having a mom who's an artist gives you is it shows you that art is a way that people make a living, and that it's a prosaic and normal way to make a living. So many people who are artistic, their parents tell them you can't do this, you're never gonna make a living, you're just gonna be starving if you do this. Whereas my mom is like, no, art makes a middle-class living, you'll puts food on the table, it's what I do. It's not going to be rich at it, but it's a normal thing, right? Also, my mom's an amazing artist. She's really, really good illustrator, and she just taught me so much. She'd be sitting next to me when I was a little girl, and she'd be like, no, that's not how you do a nose. I always remember I would do a nose. A lot of kids do a nose. It's a 7 that's upside down, and she's looking at it and she's like, where would you breathe out of that? Where are the nostrils? And so I'd start to draw them, and then it looked kind of like a pig nose, and so I learned about foreshortening, And both of those things, having sort of early knowledge of how a professional works and her early advice, but also the confidence to know that art was a totally normal way to make a living, were things that influenced me greatly. And both my parents have always been so supportive and so encouraging of everything I've done. And I feel very, very lucky that I didn't come from a family that thinks that the only way that you can make a living in this world is by getting an accounting certification.
Yeah, and I feel that's the big thing. I've seen that especially in my home. No, you can't be an artist. And I do remember specifically how with the emergence of Illustrator and all of this digital media, you speak of how your mother was illustrating for Cabbage Patch Kids, and that whole new world, if you don't adapt to it, it kind of you kind of get left behind. How would you describe that now, pertaining to now?
Well, when every time technology changes, right? And this is why I hate when Silicon Valley people are we're going to disrupt. I'm like, what does that mean, disrupt, right? How many people's lives are you going to disrupt? And not necessarily for the better, in fact, often for the worst. There's a sort of sociopathy, right, in that disrupt thing, even if good things can also come out of it. So my mom was an illustrator in an era where people who were commercial illustrators rendered type by hand and had airbrushes, physical airbrushes, that they would actually physical paint would come out of, and that's how you would do a gradation, and who would learn a huge amount of extremely technical, manual, craftsman-like skills. And when graphic design software became the new norm, all of that stuff was just like, people didn't need it anymore, right? They needed new skills with Photoshop and with Illustrator. And all of those old, very artisanal skills suddenly didn't count. I think what I'm seeing now with illustration that's really scary is print media, obviously, is dying. No one needs to tell anyone that. And all of these amazingly talented illustrators that worked for newspapers and magazines, they don't have work now, right? Because the newspapers and the magazines don't have the budgets that they did, or else the newspapers and the magazines are gone. And that's just a whole realm of talent that's going away. And this is something that also affects writers, but the amount of money that people get paid for writing or for art has not gone up since the 1950s, and in fact has generally gone down. So I know freelance journalists that literally were like risking their lives covering battles in Iraq for like $200. You know, the amount of money that people, that many people, probably most people get paid as journalists is completely unsustainable. It's the only reason that they still keep doing it is because journalism is something sacred to them and because they love it, but it's really like a murderously low pay that actually endangers people. In terms of art, which is just like a much less grave thing, it's just that places don't pay what they did in the era of Norman Rockwell, and you have to just work so hard, so hard to get by.
And do you find yourself adapting to that easily? I know I've like heard like, why do you draw when you could like get an app or like do all of that? Ugh, don't want to get on that, but
kill me, yeah.
But like, do you find yourself doing like more painting or like more graphic design or like something that's like, I know I do like graphic design when I need money because it's easier. Like people want it. People want that more.
Yeah.
And it's easier to like get jobs in that format. Like, or do you find yourself just sticking like straight to your heart? Like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna stick to this. Like,
well, it's a good question. So I'm pretty lucky, right? Like I'm in a pretty good position. Lots of people know my work. But there are definitely some things, for instance, me and two of my best friends, we started an animation studio, and we did a lot of stop motion animations, usually about political subjects, though last week I did one for a band called the Chainsmokers, which I hear like the kids these days like, even though I didn't know about it so much. And yeah, people, I definitely doing animation was something that was good for me. I've definitely seen the amount of like getting hired for print media, I don't think is a sustainable thing for most people.
that's pretty cool. I did briefly see about that, but I like, it's just like cool because you get to wear so many caps instead of just being like, I'm doing this, I'm gonna do this, and it's like you still make like a living out of that. And what else? So with specifically like your upbringing and like all of that, I noticed like the Suicide Girls and the how you spoke about that, and like you spoke about the internet back then. So it's like even though like it didn't impact like I feel like it's not like not as big of an impact, but like there's like this difference of like social media, but it's like you were also doing all of that ahead of the time. Like you were on MySpace like posting these like flyers and like promoting the I don't want to get this wrong, the name of where they had the burlesque dancers. Like,
posing Dr. Sketchies, yeah.
Like you did all of that at this time, and like you were also innovative, and I feel like that has so much to do with your success.
Oh my God, everything, yeah. Because the internet in those days, it was the way to go around the hierarchies that be. It was a way to go around the gatekeepers. If you weren't one of the people that was like chosen by the gatekeepers, the internet was your best chance for being able to make a living or make a name for yourself anyway. And it was, in some ways, I would hazard to say easier then because not everyone was on it, right? It was maybe more rare. There wasn't as much competition. Yeah, I mean, I got on Suicide Girls when I was 20 years old, so 14 years ago. And it was also interesting because, I got on as a model, right? And so I never had the experience of going on the internet as just like a normal person that wanted to make friends. You know, I was like a commodified part of a larger brand that was hiring me to, you know, pose naked for them, which is a different thing. So I think in some ways I perhaps had a relationship to the internet that was both like more guarded or more weird, or I don't know, or more self-promoting. I don't know what it was, but it was definitely different to go on, like specifically like my first social media profile was like something that I had because I was hired by this site.
Yeah, I feel like that's also, I feel like the business mentality that you have to have. Like you speak about, like you have to have a website, like it's like faking the funk, and it's like you can fake the funk, not necessarily, that's like pretty bad to say, but it's like you can have a website and it's like however you present yourself, like you were going to these places and be like, I am an artist. I like when you first decided, like in the book, it's like your name change. It's like, I am Molly.
Yeah.
And you were like, and I am an artist.
Yeah.
And it's like all of that, it's like self-reassurance, I feel like that you were doing.
Yeah.
That was very inspiring to see.
Thank you. Well, I mean, no one else is going to tell you you're an artist. No one else is going to tell you you're any good. I mean, no one else is going to like reach down and pick you up and say like, here's your dream gallery show and everything. I mean, I don't know, maybe if your parents are, I don't know, Jamie Dimon or something, but if you're just a normal person, like no one's gonna do that for you. And so you either do it for yourself or it's just never gonna happen. And I wanted to be an artist. There was just no other option for me, so that's what I did.
What do you think would be like some, either like, not advice, but like what would be like the main thing that you would say to like your old self, like going back?
I think that trying to be what other people want you to be is like just a fool's game, especially at this moment that the whole world is collapsing. No one has any idea what's going on. No like authority figure. No one knows, right? So why try to like force yourself into an uncomfortable straitjacket of a system that's already collapsing? That's ridiculous. I think that my, I guess, advice would be to be true to what you really are, but then to develop that with as much sort of rigor and passion and as much courage as you can. And that's what's going to make you the sort of life that you want.
Yeah, I find that very inspiring. And with that, I would like to say that I think it's just like important to kind of like with these books, I never found myself like, oh, I'm gonna write a book about my life. But it's like I tried to research like your whole work and all of that, everything you were doing. And it's like when you actually release Drawing Blood, it was like I have this whole personal story to what you are. And I feel like that's kind of in a sense more impactful to me than like seeing your work. Like seeing your work is like important to me, but it's like also seeing like this is what she had to go through to get to that, and like you could do it too. Yeah. And I really like how it's like you didn't have to do like starting off back to that like hard work and like talent, like describe that like easily like you don't have to have as much talent as you have and as hard as you work. Like, can you describe that? I feel like I'm not saying it like as good as you said it.
Well, I mean, I don't think anyone becomes successful just because of talent and hard work. I think that talent and hard work in some ways are the bare minimum, but there are other things as well. And I've known enough brilliant people who are completely broke and who are living in incredibly precarious situations to not believe that there's some, God sitting up there objectively rewarding genius. And in terms of hard work alone very often just gets you exploited by other people who take the advantages of that. I often think that you need talent and hard work, obviously, but you also need a sort of skepticism towards the system and an unwillingness to be exploited and I want to say like shrewd and cold eye to the power structures that be and how you might be able to use them in a way that keeps your soul and advances what you want to do in the world without becoming part of them.
And when you speak of the system, is it the system, like the bigger systems that in place for people?
Yeah, I mean,
or like the art system.
I think the art system, but I mean, I guess oh man, I'm gonna sound so wanky. I want to say like the system of of capitalism and the systems of our larger society as well.
Yeah, I mean that does have. That's why I'm like, is it the art world? But all that plays into capitalism. And I just, when I hear you say that, it's like, I feel like you start off, like when I started off, it's like, oh, I'm so nice. And it's like, no, like you gotta be firm about it. Especially like as a woman, like, how does that feel? Like having to do all of this, like you're actually changing up the game.
Yeah, exactly. And no one likes people that change up the game. They might say they like them 40 years later, but at the time they're like, nah, that was a bitch. No one really likes game changers very much. But yeah, it's always hard to start doing something. It's always hard to go against a lot of societal training. You know, a lot of society is about telling women that they're not good enough, that they're stupid, that their primary purpose in life is to be nice and to be likable, and anything that they do that's not nice and that's not likable is an ultimate sin. And if you ever want to do anything great in this world, you can't spend your whole life worrying about being liked.
Yeah, I feel that. And I think one last thing that I wanted to ask was, when I was reading as well, I saw like a little bit, since it was very personal, you were like, there was this line specifically, and it's like, if Anthony didn't like me, then I was gonna be the greatest artist ever.
Yeah, when my boyfriend broke up with me, when I was going through a bad breakup, and I was like, well, you know, if my boyfriend, who I love so much, if he doesn't like me anymore, well, you know, oh, that's so terrible. But well, I'm gonna be the greatest artist ever because it's the only way that could ever redeem me if this boy doesn't like me.
And how did that turn out, like, later on in life? Like, do you constantly set these goals, like, you know what, like, they doubted me, I'm gonna go prove them wrong, and it's like, oh, like, I completed the goal now, like, what's next? Like, how does that work for you?
I used to have a joke, I once tweeted, I was like, the chip on my shoulder is made of diamond. But, I mean, now I don't think like that anymore. Like, maybe it's just getting older or getting to do more of the work I wanna do. But yeah, at the beginning I was like, yeah, I'll show you, all of you. And it was a major motivating thing.
Does that, like, I feel like with the more work, it's like also like a humbling experience too, when it's like, ugh, like internet, all of that really doesn't matter. Like, let me just make art. How do you feel?
No, I definitely feel that. I mean, life is so damn short, and it's like, how many moments do we really have until, you know, death and the void? And I just want to make the best work that I can and try to make something that I hope will last. And even though I'm just as petty as every other human in the world, I do try to remember that to keep me on path.
And does this mean that, like, you constantly, do you always wear your artist hat?
No.
Or is it just like the Molly artist hat, or is it like the, how do you walk the world? Do you walk the world as an artist? Do you walk the world like, what do you do?
I don't know, man. I think I like don't walk the world that much. I'm mostly like in my apartment, like in my bathrobe. But I don't know. I think I spend most of my time just, I guess I don't think about who I am. I mean, I just make stuff, you know?
Mm-hmm. Do you think questioning the self is like something that's important to creating work?
It can be. It can be. I mean, I think it's important, you know, to question where you come from, to question whatever biases you may have. But I also think sometimes it's great to forget about yourself too in your work and to look outwards.
And I also just being like a Latina, you are a Latina. Like, how does that impact your work? Like, being in different situations, like, does that sort of identity ever kind of like make you question like the way you're viewing like these situations?
So because, you know, obviously like I pass as white, it doesn't really affect that in many contexts, you know, but I think when I was working in Puerto Rico, because, you know, it's my dad's island, right? And it's a place that I grew up, you know, very immersed in hearing the history of, and that I grew up visiting also. I think that I definitely had a different perspective of it and of its status as a colony, but also just of like the people there than perhaps a lot of journalists who had never been there before or had only been there on vacation. I don't know, I don't even want to say like that I had more empathy because the life experience of someone who grew up in, in a mountain town in Puerto Rico and lived there their whole life is different than mine as someone who grew up in New York. But I definitely think I had a different perspective on it, and I knew more of its history.
That's great to hear. So now I'm going to open it up for questions. Somebody does have a microphone, and please raise your hand if anyone has a question, and they will run up to you.
I'm going to go to the ones in the back here first. While I make my way over there, we will also be signing books out in the lobby if you have any other questions that we don't get to today. But here's our first one.
So you have been in some of the worst situations, seeing people in the worst conditions imaginable, suffering, torture, inhumane treatment. How does that make you feel? How do you handle your feelings? I could almost imagine that you could be experiencing some kind of PTSD, and how do you manage that experience?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think my feelings matter that much compared to, the people who are living in these prisons or who are living in these war zones, because I go in there voluntarily, right, and I leave, after pretty brief time periods. So I mostly just try to think about doing a good job and doing, true by their stories.
Sticking right back here.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm interested if there is a symbolic, in your frame of reference, a symbolic meaning to splattered ink, which seems to be a commonality to almost all of your artwork.
Well, originally, the ink splatter started because I'm just messy by nature, and I would have a dip pen, and, sometimes the ink splatters. And I was like, let me see how I can work with this. And obviously, I love Ralph Steadman. If anyone in this room does not know Ralph Steadman, he is a god. He is Hunter S. Thompson's illustrator. But sometimes also, there's a violence to it, right? Like, it can look like, like blood or like explosions, or yeah, it looks like your medium exploding, and it has an intensity to it. So I think that's why I do like it.
Over here.
You alluded to this, but how do you protect yourself from having your work acquired or reproduced by an organization or imitated by a copycat artist?
Well, I don't usually post high-res work online unless there's a real reason, like unless it's something that I want to be reproduced. And if you only post low-res work online, there's only so much that people can do with it. Whenever I've had my work ripped off before, like if I've definitely had people put it on T-shirts or whatever, I just yelled at them until they stopped. I haven't had it done by a large corporation with a lot of money yet, though, thank God. So we'll see when that happens.
We're right here in the center.
You mentioned that you often took photographs and then drew from the photographs. How do you feel by drawing you're able to do and express more than you can or someone could just through photography? And how can photography sometime do the same thing that you try to do through drawing?
Well, I can't express anything from photography because I'm not talented, so that's my first thing. I think that drawing has a lot of technical things that it can do that photography can't. It can emphasize or de-emphasize things in different ways. It can use color, it can use line weight, it can use all of our arsenal of skills and techniques to try to emphasize particular truths in an image. However, there are so many brilliant photojournalists in this world, and those photojournalists who usually operate with a bravery that awes me and that I find unimaginable, they do something very similar with the craft with which they take the photos, right? The other thing that drawings can do that photos can't is that photos have to be there. A photo has to, if you're a war photographer, you have to go to the front line, and when there are bullets flying, you have to stick your head up and you have to take that photo. Whereas with me, I can interview someone who is there, and very carefully through that, I can reconstruct what something is like. And one of the things I was always struck with when I saw Joe Sacco's Palestine, which is an amazing book, is he has this series of scenes that he did that are based on people's memories of jails. And obviously, there aren't cameras in jails. There's not a sketch artist in a jail. There's not a photojournalist in a jail, and for very good reasons. It's because power wants to censor what goes on in jails. But what an artist can do, what our special power is it can take things that would have otherwise been impossible to see, right, and keep them from being lost to the memory hole. It can make them visual again.
This will actually be our last question.
Well, you said something that resonated with me. You said something about being, just doing total activist art and how hollow that is. But then I thought, the personal is political, and I look at your illustrations and your work, and I think, I'm sure your burlesque stuff has an element of politics in it. In other words, how can you separate the two, or were you think of anything specific when you said that?
Well, I don't think that activist art is hollow, but I think that confining your entire being to only doing activist art, and that's like going to be your entire identity, and you're going to do nothing else, I think that is something that burns people out, because I think that people, contain multitudes. I also do believe that the personal is indeed political, but I think that it's very different to. Like, for instance, I'm trying to think of like the perfect book to use this, but let's say a book by like Baldwin, right, who's one of the the greatest American writers in history. Like, when Baldwin writes Giovanni's Room, there is an intense and sophisticated political thing behind that, but it's also like a human story about love and self-hatred. And the Baldwin's politics, I don't think, were something that straitjacketed his analysis of people and his analysis of life and love and death. I think his politics were something instead that came from those things, and that by him examining the human condition, he expressed those politics as well, as opposed to them being like an external like code that he was like, I'm going to tick this box and this box and this box. Well, I mean, I agree with you. Like, it can, but I just think that people, can have more to them and not solely be activists. That's what I'm saying.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.